I never imagined the hardest words I'd ever hear would come from my own son. 3 days before his wedding, my phone buzzed while I was replacing a damaged porch railing for an elderly couple in Columbus, Ohio. I wiped the sawdust off my hands, smiled when I saw Ethan's name on the screen, and expected another question about seating arrangements or tuxedos. Instead, I read a single text. "Dad, you're not welcome anymore. Please don't come. It'll be better for everyone." I stared at those words until the screen went dark. No explanation. No phone call. Nothing. For a long moment, I just stood there with a hammer in one hand and my phone in the other, wondering how a son I'd spent my whole life loving could reduce me to 11 words. The elderly homeowner, Mrs. Carter, noticed something was wrong. "Everything okay, Daniel?" I forced a smile that even I didn't believe. "Yeah, just family stuff." She nodded kindly, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. That night, I drove back to my small house on the edge of Dublin, Ohio. The place wasn't fancy, just a quiet two-bedroom home I'd bought after my divorce almost 9 years earlier. Every wall held memories of Ethan growing up. His Little League trophy still sat on a shelf in the living room, covered in a thin layer of dust. I had never found the heart to pack it away. I read his message again. Maybe he sent it by mistake. Maybe someone else had his phone. Maybe there was something he wasn't telling me. I called him. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Then one more text appeared. "Please don't make this harder." That sentence hurt more than the first. For the first time in years, I wondered if I had somehow become the kind of father a son feels embarrassed to claim. I sat alone in the silence, replaying every birthday, every baseball game, every late-night drive after football practice, searching for the moment I had failed him. I couldn't find one. What I didn't know was that someone had spent months carefully rewriting my son's opinion of me. And by the time the truth finally came out, an entire ballroom filled with strangers would stand on their feet while my own son struggled to look me in the eyes. The next morning, I almost drove to Ethan's apartment anyway. I even had my suit hanging in the back seat, the same navy blue suit I'd worn to every important moment in his life. His high school graduation, his college commencement at Ohio State, the day he landed his first engineering job in Cincinnati. But I couldn't bring myself to ignore what he'd asked. Instead, I parked outside Scioto Park, turned off the engine, and sat there watching fathers push toddlers on swings while I tried to understand how my own relationship with Ethan had unraveled so completely. It hadn't always been this way. After my divorce from Melissa, Ethan lived with his mother during the week and stayed with me every other weekend. It wasn't the arrangement either of us wanted, but we made the best of it. We'd spend Saturdays fixing old furniture in my garage, grab burgers at Thurman Cafe, and in the evening watching Cleveland Browns games, even when they lost. Those weekends were never about money. They were about time. Somewhere along the way, though, time stopped being enough. When Ethan started dating Claire, things slowly changed. At first, she was polite, even warm. But little comments began slipping into conversations. "You still do carpentry? You never thought about starting a real company? I guess blue-collar work pays the bills." She always smiled after saying things like that, making it impossible to call them insults. I ignored them. Ethan ignored them too, or at least I thought he did. Then, over the last year, his calls became shorter. Weekend visits disappeared. Birthdays turned into quick text messages instead of dinners together. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he'd blame work. "I've just been busy, Dad." I believed him because I wanted to. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Margaret Holloway, president of the Ohio Craftsman Heritage Foundation. "Daniel," she said cheerfully, "just confirming you'll be attending Saturday night's ceremony in Cleveland. The governor's office finalized everything this morning." For a moment, I completely forgot about the wedding. "I'll be there." Before we continue, if this story has touched your heart so far, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It really helps me bring you more stories like this. Now, let's see what happened next. I answered quietly. "We can't wait to present you with the Lifetime Achievement Award. 40 years of preserving historic American craftsmanship deserves to be celebrated." I thanked her and ended the call. I had spent decades restoring schools, churches, and century-old homes across Ohio without ever asking for recognition. Ironically, the same weekend my own son decided I wasn't welcome in his life. Complete strangers were preparing to honor everything I had spent a lifetime building. Saturday arrived faster than I wanted it to. By noon, I had already made peace with the fact that I wouldn't be sitting in the second row of my son's wedding, watching him start the next chapter of his life. Instead, I packed an overnight bag and drove 2 hours north to Cleveland, where the Lifetime Achievement Awards banquet was being held inside the historic Hilton, Cleveland downtown. I kept telling myself it was just another event. Smile. Say thank you. Go home. Nothing more. The ballroom was already filling with architects, preservation experts, business owners, and state officials. Large photographs of restored landmarks lined the entrance, and I froze when I recognized several buildings I'd spent years rebuilding with my own hands. I had never expected anyone to remember. A young volunteer handed me a program. On the cover was my photograph. Beneath it were the words, Daniel Harper 2026 Lifetime Achievement Award for 4 decades of preserving America's historic craftsmanship. I stared at it for several seconds. Not because I was proud, because I wished Ethan could have seen it. Just then, my phone vibrated. It was my younger sister, Rachel. I answered immediately. How's the wedding? I asked, trying to sound stronger than I felt. There was a long silence. Daniel, she whispered. You need to know something. My stomach tightened. What happened? Ethan's asking where you are. I laughed softly, though it sounded more like disappointment. He knows exactly where I am. Rachel sighed. No, he doesn't. Before I could respond, she continued. A guest brought a magazine into the reception. What magazine? American Legacy. I frowned. I've never heard of it. You don't have to, she replied. Your story is on the cover. I stood speechless. Months earlier, a journalist had interviewed me about restoring historic courthouses across Ohio and mentoring young tradesmen. I'd almost forgotten about it after postponing the interview twice because of work. Apparently, the issue had been released that very morning. Rachel's voice grew quieter. Someone recognized you from the magazine and asked Ethan if you were related. What did he say? At first, he proudly said you were his father. She paused. But then they asked why you weren't at the wedding. I closed my eyes. Rachel continued. They started talking about your career, the national preservation projects, the apprentices you've trained, the scholarships you quietly funded after your retirement. I felt my chest grow heavy. Ethan kept saying. She stopped. Saying what? He kept repeating, I didn't know. Before I could answer, another voice came over the ballroom speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll please take your seats, tonight's ceremony is about to begin. Rachel took a slow breath. Daniel. Yeah. I think your son just realized he never truly knew the man who spent his entire life trying to become the father he needed. The line went silent. I slipped my phone into my pocket, looked toward the brightly lit stage, and had no idea that within the next 20 minutes, the doors of that ballroom were about to open in a way that would change both our lives forever. The ballroom lights dimmed as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Tonight we recognize a man whose work has preserved more than buildings. He's preserved history, dignity, and the stories that future generations will inherit. I wasn't listening anymore. My mind was still on Ethan. I wondered if he was angry, confused, or simply regretting the message he'd sent. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard my name. Please welcome this year's Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, Daniel Harper. The room erupted in applause. Hundreds of people rose to their feet. For a second, I couldn't move. Then I slowly walked toward the stage. As I reached the podium, I noticed movement near the back of the ballroom. The large doors had opened. 3 figures stood there, catching their breath as if they'd run the entire length of the hotel. Rachel, Claire, and Ethan. Our eyes met from across the room. His face was pale. His suit was wrinkled. It looked as though he'd left the wedding reception without a second thought. The applause faded as I accepted the Crystal Award from the governor. I took a deep breath before speaking. I've spent 40 years working with wood. A few people smiled. The funny thing about old wood is that no matter how damaged it looks, if you're patient enough, you can often restore it instead of replacing it. The room grew completely silent. I used to think people were different. I glanced toward Ethan. But life has a way of teaching you that relationships aren't built in a single day, and they rarely fall apart in one either. I wasn't speaking to the audience anymore. I was speaking to my son. I've made mistakes. I've missed birthdays because I was rebuilding schools after storms. I've worked weekends because families needed roofs over their heads. But there has never been a single morning, not one, where I woke up and didn't love my son. Ethan lowered his head. Claire quietly wiped tears from her face. Then, before I could continue, Ethan stepped forward, ignoring every camera in the room, ignoring every guest watching. He walked all the way to the front of the stage. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I believed people who judged your paycheck instead of your character." The ballroom was so quiet that every word echoed. I thought success meant expensive suits, fancy offices, and impressive titles. He looked at the award in my hands. But everyone in this room already knew something I was too blind to see. His eyes filled with tears. My father was never an ordinary carpenter. He was the man who quietly spent his life building things that would outlive him, including me. I stepped off the stage and pulled him into a hug. The applause returned, louder than before, but I barely heard it. Because no award, no standing ovation, and no public recognition could ever compare to hearing my son whisper the words I'd been waiting years to hear. "I've always been proud to be your son. I just forgot what truly matters." As we walked out of that ballroom together, I realized something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The greatest legacy isn't the buildings you restore, it's the hearts you're willing to rebuild before it's too late. The weeks after the ceremony passed more quietly than I expected. There were interviews, letters from people I'd never met, and invitations to speak at trade schools across Ohio. Reporters wanted to talk about craftsmanship, restoration, and the award. But none of those things mattered as much as the phone call I received 4 days later. It was Ethan. Not a text, not a voicemail, a real phone call. "Dad," he said nervously, "would you come over for dinner this Sunday?" There was something different in his voice. For the first time in years, he wasn't calling out of obligation. He was calling because he wanted me there. When I arrived at his house in Cincinnati that Sunday afternoon, I noticed something immediately. The wedding photos had already been framed and placed on the fireplace. But there was one new picture sitting in the center. It wasn't from the wedding. It was a photograph someone had taken at the awards ceremony. The moment we hugged, Claire opened the door before I could knock. "I'm glad you're here, Daniel," she said sincerely. There was no trace of the quiet judgment she used to hide behind polite smiles. "I owe you an apology." I smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything." "Actually," she replied, lowering her eyes, "I do." During dinner, Ethan finally told me everything. Months before the wedding, he had started comparing his life to his college friends. Many of their fathers were executives, attorneys, or business owners. Social media only made it worse. Every weekend seemed filled with luxury vacations, expensive watches, and country club events. "I started believing success had a certain look," he admitted. "And I was embarrassed because you didn't fit that picture." He swallowed hard before continuing. "When people asked what my dad did, I'd just say, he's a carpenter." I never stopped to think about the lives you'd changed or the communities you'd helped rebuild. I reached across the table and rested my hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, you don't have to explain anymore." He shook his head. "No, Dad, I do." He disappeared into another room and returned carrying a small wooden box. "I found this while cleaning Mom's attic." Inside were dozens of old photographs. Pictures of us building birdhouses together, fishing trips at Alum Creek Lake, my cheering from the bleachers at his baseball games, and one faded photo of 7-year-old Ethan sitting proudly beside the first bookshelf we had ever built together. Taped to the back was a child's messy handwriting. "My dad can build anything." Ethan's voice cracked as he read the words aloud. "I forgot this kid." I felt tears fill my own eyes. "No," I said softly. "You just lost him for a little while." A few months later, Ethan asked if we could spend one Saturday every month working together in my workshop. No phones, no meetings, no distractions, just father and son. The first project we built wasn't for a customer. It wasn't for money. Together, we built a handcrafted bookshelf for the children's reading room at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus. As we carried it through the hospital doors, Ethan smiled and said, "Now I understand your legacy." I smiled back. My legacy was never the houses I restored or the awards on my shelf. It was making sure my son learned that a person's true worth isn't measured by their title, their salary, or the clothes they wear, but by the lives they quietly make better. And this time, he didn't just hear my words. He believed them.